Alright, in today's video we are talking about the newest Fuji camera. Well, it was the newest Fuji camera until like this week when they announced another one, but in this video we're talking about the Fuji X-H2S. Now, I was able to test and review this camera thanks to today's sponsor, which is Borrow Lenses, but more on them later. So as we normally do on the channel, we are not going to break down every feature of this camera. If you want to learn about all the specs and all the technical things, go watch a Gerald Undone video. In this video, we are going to be paying attention only to image quality. Can this camera be used in a cinematic way? Can you use it for commercials? Can you use it for short films, music videos, stuff like that? And is the image quality going to hold up for you and give you a really nice image, or is it something that's just going to be like every other mirrorless camera on the market? And I'm just going to spoil that right now. This camera is very good. The main reason that I wanted to try out this camera was because I do own a Fuji X-T3. I've had it for a couple years now, and I've always liked the Fuji camera because it's a nice hybrid camera because it takes amazing stills with really fun film simulations, but I've always also had it just in case I wanted to shoot a little 10-bit video on the side. Well, this is basically a Fuji camera spec'd out as far as it can go. So it has all the features of all the other Fuji cameras: flip out screen, nice LCD, the film simulations, 422 10-bit internal codecs. This one specifically actually shoots in ProRes HQ. I didn't even try out another codec on here. Why would I care? I want the best editing codec that they make, which is ProRes, and it shoots it internally in camera, which there's almost no other cameras on the market right now that do that other than real cinema cameras, like, well, I say real, things that actually have cinema camera in the name, like the Blackmagic Pocket or something like that. But this one gives you all the functionality of a hybrid stills camera as well. Now, the thing that people are very excited about this camera is that it will shoot 3.2 6.2K open gate. What that means is just you're gonna get the full readout of the sensor. The sensor's a 3.2 sensor for stills photography. Normally we shoot in like a 16:9 or DCI 17:9 aspect ratio for video, so we're cropping into sensors a lot of the time. So we're not usually getting the full height of the sensor, but with this camera you can. And you actually get 6.2K, so you're getting a full readout of the sensor, but when you're shooting 4K on this camera, you're actually going into that 17:9 or 16:9, and you are oversampling from that 6K sensor and then packaging it into the 4K file. And that's the first thing I want to talk about. A lot of cameras are doing this now. It's really nice when you can oversample the sensor and then put it into the 4K resolution because you get nice color and really nice detail that way. So that's the first thing I really noticed about this camera is the sharpness. Now, Fuji cameras are kind of notorious for having sharpening built into the settings, but if you go in, turn the sharpness down to -4, and then also the noise reduction, because you don't want any kind of weird noise reduction happening on the camera, because Fujis are kind of weird about that too. Turn that down to -4, and the camera is still very sharp. Now, I tried this with a lot of different lenses. I tried it with vintage lenses. I tried it with my Viltrox speed booster, which usually makes lenses look a little softer and have less contrast. And I also tried it with the nice 16 to 55 millimeter f2.8 lens. That's a Fuji lens. It's a really nice sharp stills lens. At 6K and at 4K, the image is still really sharp. Now, I talk a lot on this channel about detail and how I like detail, and I do like a sharp image. This one's just a lot. And it doesn't look fake sharp. It doesn't look like sharpening is added, luckily, because that would be like kind of a major buzzkill for me. This one just looks really sharp. I even tried it with my little Viltrox 23mm f1.4, and when you open up that lens, it usually is pretty soft. I mean, it's a very like low-end lens that I use a lot though, because I like that it kind of is in the middle between vintage and not, because it has autofocus. Still very sharp, and you can see that in the tests here. Right, so as I do on this channel, I'm not really gonna test slow motion. I'm not gonna test how the ergonomics of the camera. We're just going to look at image quality. So there's going to be a bunch of tests coming up here in this video that I did with the camera, the things that I do with the camera to see if I like it and how I would use it. But I don't want to get too far off track there. I do want to talk a little bit about it. The ergonomics of this camera are not quite like an X-T3 or X-T4 and stuff like that. They've changed it a little bit more. It's more kind of like the GFX line. The thing that is really nice about this is on the side you get a full Hdmi port, which is something that is new to me coming from the X-T3. I do like that. I do miss some of the dials on top, but you know what? It's definitely not a deal breaker by any means. And like with any, mirrorless camera, you can build it up to be something like a cinema camera. You can throw a monitor on there. And what's cool about this is that we do have the full size HDMI. Ignore this ridiculously long one. It's the only one I have right now. But then we also have the ability to power it through USB-C. So I have that running into this Momin V-mount battery that they sent me. Thanks, Momin, for sending this out. It's got like a couple USB-C ports on there. There's a USB A port on there, as well as your typical DTAP ports, etc. And it has this really nice readout on the back of it, so you can actually see what the percentage is on the battery and stuff like that. It's really handy. It's also a micro. It's like smaller than a lot of the other V mounts. I'm actually shooting on the Fuji X-H2S right now with my Viltrox 23mm f1.4. I believe I'm at f1.4, so the audio is going through the Fuji right now, as well as all the images you're going to see on the screen are with the Fuji as well. So you can just stare at the Fuji image for the rest of the A-roll here. I've got some sun kind of dappling in the background. I've got an aperture P300C over shooting into a white door next to me. So this is real life scenario with the camera. So I didn't test out the open gate 6K too much because it's not that appealing to me. I know it is for a lot of other people out there, but I actually like just the 4K 16:9. The 6.2K open gate is fun if you're trying to shoot anamorphic, or if you're trying to get, you know, a different aspect ratio, you want a little bit of a taller image. But in most scenarios, I'm not really able to shoot in those aspect ratios. I do think it's a fun feature to have though. And knowing that, you need to know that this isn't like a Panasonic S5. It's not full of those video features like anamorphic modes and stuff like that. You're going to have to do that kind of stuff yourself, but it is nice that you have the option to film the whole sensor, which is really nice if you're doing some like vertical content for videos or something like that, you know, some 9:16 content, because you have the extra real estate on the top to be able to crop in for like a phone or something like that. Okay, but we on this channel talk about narrative filmmaking and stuff like that, cinematic images, so let's talk about the image quality now. The image quality is great. It's really nice. Just like everyone else kind of says, there is a lot of latitude on this camera, a lot of dynamic range. So my first thought was, obviously, let's set it up against the Red Komodo, which isn't spec to have a ton of dynamic range, but when you properly expose that camera and you're shooting in RAW, you are able to push and pull those images a lot. So I set it up against the Fuji here outside, and I was kind of in some dappled light underneath a tree, and then I have a lot of sunlight in the background, so you can kind of see the differences in the light to darkness there. And then I brought in a little bounce card, which just so I could have a little bit of proper lighting on my face. So if you were to properly light this camera and any other camera like you should be doing to begin with, what does it look like? How does it perform? So here's a little side-by-side between my Red Komodo and the Fuji X-H2S, which is about a third of the cost. And you can see right off the bat, it's way sharper. I can't remember, I might have had the sharpening settings not turned down for this test, but I'm pretty sure I did. And you can see that they're both, you know, the Komodo for some reason doesn't look as sharp, and it's shooting 6K RAW. Now the Komodo is notoriously noisy, and a lot of people say this camera is kind of noisy. And I definitely found some noise on the Fuji, but it was nothing that bothered me because the ISO is shooting at 1250. In f-log2, which is the color profile that I use, because that's the one that's going to give you the most dynamic range, and that's the only thing that I plan on using with this camera. And, you know, people say it's around 14 stops, and I can see it. You can really see in the highlights here with this kind of the stock contrast and like kind of Rec 709 look for the Fuji. You actually have more detail in the highlights back there than you do on the Red. Now the Red is at 400 or 800 ISO. I even for this test bumped it up to 1250, 1280, I believe, just so we could see like a comparison. And I can pull all the information back on the Red, but the actual like stock levels, you're getting more out of the Fuji. There's just more room to wiggle in the shadows and the highlights. Basically, your midtones are already going to be exposed in a little bit of a better spot on the Fuji compared to the Red. And this is kind of common anyways with the Red. It doesn't ever bother me because I just light properly, but it is something to consider that the Fuji kind of has a little bit different of an illuminance curve right out of the gate. What I found what interesting about this is when you do push and pull it though, you can like lower the exposure a lot or raise the exposure a lot, and you're not losing, and you have detail in both areas on the Fuji. Of course you do on the Red as well, but you're shooting RAW on the Red. So the point here is that the Fuji is an extremely capable camera. The ProRes 422 HQ is a very capable codec coming off this sensor. Now Fuji kind of has weird color science. When you're using their stock Rec 709 and stuff like that, especially on this one with f-log2, it just leans really magenta heavy. Now it's something you might want to tweak yourself. For all these tests, you know, I've been really into this like kind of film emulation lately, so I've been using this 2393 film emulation, and so that's what I use for all these tests, because I find that so what if the color science is kind of weird on a camera, if I just convert it and tweak it a little bit and then I throw this color on there, which is the color I like anyways, then it's going to kind of make that camera shine in the way that I would use it. So that's what we're going to be using for these tests. But I also think it's a really good test because when you start really playing with the color on a camera, you can start to see things break and see things get weird. And when I use this same kind of color profile on the Fuji X-T3, it does not hold up near as well as it did on this new X-H2S. This camera is totally different, and it's kind of the next level of Fuji. Okay, before I jump into some more tests here, I want to talk about today's sponsor, which is Borrow Lenses. Now, Borrow Lenses is the reason that I'm able to use this Fuji X-H2S right now, and it's something that you might want to consider on a future shoot, or if you're maybe trying to use something like I'm, test it out before you buy it. It's a really simple process. You can just go to borrowlenses.com. You pick the dates that you want to rent your item, and they have all sorts of cameras on there and lenses and accessories and anything you might need for your next shoot. You pick the dates you want your equipment in, and I usually pick the day before to make sure that the camera can arrive on time. I can set up the camera, make sure I know it before I go out and take it on a shoot. And then you have it where you can send it back the day after you are done with it. Now, I've rented cameras since day one of my career because you don't always have the money to pay for the camera you're wanting, or maybe you just want to try a different camera for a different shoot. You know, there's times where maybe you need two bodies. Maybe you already own, like me, for instance, I have a red Komodo, and sometimes I rent a second red Komodo for a shoot if I need two cameras, and Borrow Lenses makes it super easy to do something like that. There's free shipping for orders over $149, and you can choose to pick up from one of their various locations or have it shipped right to you. When you're done, you can just use the prepaid shipping label and drop off at a UPS store. Just package it up the way that it was sent to you, and then you can just send it back, and it just makes it super easy for you. So if you need to try out a new camera, if you need a second body for a shoot, you can just use Borrow Lenses to get that job done. And you can use my code SpencerS to get 20% off your first order. So I want to thank Borrow Lenses for sponsoring this video. So then I took it out and just kind of walked around the neighborhood with it just to kind of see how it handled outside. And this is at sunset, and you can see a lot of the dynamic range here. And even the IBIS I just left on, and I even, you know, had the optical image stabilization on the zoom lens, the 16-55, which normally I don't really care about IBIS, but I wanted to see how it performed because they're all over the place when it comes to in-body image stabilization, and I feel like that this camera has really nice in-body image stabilization. I would not hesitate to use this if you're just kind of walking around doing some dock stuff. For cinema use, that's something that I wouldn't use very often, but if you are buying this camera as your kind of sole camera, your A camera, it is something to note. So then when I wanted to test it more into some controlled environments, did them in this little room here, and I put the Aperture P300C over here bouncing off the wall, and I'm using a lot of that dappled light in the background kind of as, you know, the backlight coming in. Exposing for the highlights, but making sure my face still looks nice. So once again, we're at ISO 1250 on all this, f-log2, ProRes 422 HQ. Now, if you are interested in the autofocus is way better than any other Fuji camera that I've ever used. Now, I haven't used an X-T4, I've only come from the X-T3, but I feel like it held up really well. Now, there was some hunting if I did something too dramatic. I mean, I could, you know, if you like really left the frame or put something up and then pulled it away, you are going to see some hunting. That's unfortunate, but it does snap two eyes if you are using the eye tracking. Now, maybe if you're not using eye tracking, it wouldn't, you know, hunt as much, but for what I do, if I'm doing something like a little A-roll setup like this, it works really well. Like I can move into the camera right now, kept it with my eyes basically, and then I can back up. That's pretty good. That's like, for most people, that's all you really need. Like if you're doing like a little gimbal shot, it's gonna be able to hold focus on something. It's when you do something dramatic, like put something in front of the screen like this, and then pull it away. Didn't even hunt that bad on that one. So that's just something to note. I haven't played with the settings at all on that, but it is much better than the X-T3, I would say. X-T3 really isn't that bad. I think people give it a bad rap, but it's when you're comparing it to Canon and Sony, and those things are just so good. So image quality here, you can see very nice highlight latitude going on here. The colors are really nice. So I did a couple things here. First, I just wanted to try out the 16-55mm lens some more, that zoom lens, which is at 2.8, just kept it at 2.8 the whole time. Just put it in a scenario with some color and some latitude, you know, properly lit, just to see how it would look on my skin and whatnot. So here's just kind of how it looks with f-log, with the Rec 709 conversion. You kind of have to do your own contrast with this because the Rec 709 only gives you the color back, which is weird. That's the LUT that actually you can download from Fuji's website. And then here's with that 2393 color emulation that I've been playing with on there. And I'll just be using that for the rest of the test. And then, you know, just really paying attention to the sharpness here. Please ignore the like hair and skin on my face. I just woke up when I did this, and I just noticed how sharp it was. So then after that, I wanted to throw on the Viltrox speed booster that I have for my X-T3. So it's an X mount 0.71x speed booster, focal reducer that's going to give you kind of the equivalent to a full frame with this camera. And then I thought that might help soften the image a little bit. And then I also threw on my Canon vintage FD lens, so the 55mm f1.2, to see if that could help soften things up. And it did. It obviously added its character and made things a lot smoother, but it's still really sharp. If you look at the edges of my mustache there, which, up close and personal with me, it's still really sharp. And this is at 4K. And at 6K too, obviously they're both sharp. Which is interesting is they're both sharp at 6K and 4K, so oversampling it definitely holds that detail. So if you don't like sharpness and you want to use this camera, be sure to put a softening filter or something in front of the lens because you might need it. So I tried a few different lenses here. We did that. I also threw the Viltrox 23mm f1.4 on, tried that out, wanted to test the autofocus on that a little bit, wanted to test out how that looked. So we could just see how this camera would perform in kind of all those different scenarios. And you can just be the judge, but I think this camera is really nice and really holds up. I really like that you can push and pull the image, and the ProRes is super easy to edit. Yeah, the camera can get a little bit noisy, but that's with the noise reduction turned all the way down. And I just do that on purpose, that way I can get more of the latitude in the shadows, and then I can simply just add a little noise reduction in post and have full control over it rather than having Fuji do all the work. Something that you can't really change that much on something like a Sony, which is really great low light capabilities, but you can't really tweak the noise reduction settings like you can on this camera. You can turn them down and then have full control once you get into the computer. So these are just kind of my first thoughts over the camera, but if you want to hear more, you can actually go over to my Patreon page and join our Discord, and you can come chat with me about this camera and hear more thoughts on it and join other filmmakers. You know, we kind of jump in there and we talk about cameras and lighting and cinematography and stuff like that. And now that I have this camera in, I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion over the Fuji X-H2S. Just a great place to ask me things about cameras and advice on cinematography. So if you're interested in that, there'll be a link to that in the description below. Well, that's all I have for this video, so until next time guys, I'm Sensor Sakurai. See ya.